Welcome to the Nutrition Mission Podcast.
This is where we're going to share information about nutrition and have insights into your own personal needs, as well as product information, as well as other information. You've got to be part of this nutrition mission.
This is the official Clark's Nutrition and Natural Foods Market podcast. And we've been helping people live better lives since 1972. We're on a nutrition mission. Join us.
All right, this is Starkie Sowers. Welcome again to another Nutrition Mission episode podcast brought to you by Clark's Nutrition and Natural Foods Markets. So exciting day. I like talking about vitamin D. We're going to talk about vitamin D. We're going to talk about vitamin K. So it's kind of weird with the K thing because things have really changed in the last 5 or 6 years when it comes to vitamin K. So I thought I'd just kind of lay out some foundations because vitamin K and vitamin D work together. Both of these are fat-soluble compounds, fat-soluble vitamins. Remember, to be a vitamin, there has to be a nutrient deficiency link to that vitamin, right? So when we think of vitamin D, we'll talk about some of the links that are to it. So obviously, vitamin D is really kind of crazy. Vitamin D literally exploded when it came to the research in the 90s. In fact, there was a doctor here in town. He cruised around. He was a research doctor, and he basically on his license plate, it said Dr. Vitamin D. And he was heading up a bunch of vitamin D research all over the place. And so it's kind of interesting. I like to talk a little bit about stories from back in the day. So as I was a typical high school kid back in the 70s. I ditched every class. I'd get my hands off whenever I could and all that sort of stuff. Because you think, hey, man, it's not important to go to school. So somewhere in my senior year, I kind of woke up oh, crap. The new world is coming here, and I'm going to have to get a job. Mind you, my dad owned a gym or I had a job, so I thought I was set. Didn't know he was selling the gym, so it really perked me up. I thought, man, I better get my act together, find out what I'm going to do in life, sort of thing. Had no clue, right? So anyways, bottom line was I ended up getting, as a senior student, one of my classes was library assistant, okay? So that means you got to take the books, and you got to learn the Dewey Decimal System, you got to file the books away, you got to do all these little crazy things and stuff like that. So every day, the librarian would give me these tweaks. Hey, I want you to research your name. Well, how do I do that? Well, you have to look in these books. Remember, we didn't have the internet back in those days, all right? Internet literally was just starting to form by 1980. And remember, the internet, the use of the internet was usually used between UCs connecting and helping people. I could talk all about that. But we really didn't see that until the late 80s. It's starting to see that actually take shape and take form. All right? So ultimately, every day she had an assignment. So okay, what are some of the things that you're interested in? Nutrition, working out, this and that. Research your name, research this. And then one day she goes, you like vitamins? I go, I love vitamins. I go to Clark's all the time. I'm over there buying vitamin supplements. And she goes, okay, I want you to do research on vitamins. Great. Okay, so she gave me some names, vitamin D, vitamin this, and all this stuff like that. Of course, I knew about vitamin D by that point. I'm like, yeah, so vitamin D is rickets or whatever. So anyways, I get this book. I start reading about vitamin D. Starts talking about pro-hormones. I was a non-steroid athlete. If there's anything that's natural, that's like pro-hormone, bring it on. How much am I going to take? How much can I get? Right? So I started reading about it. I'm like, what do you mean it's a pro-hormone? And so what's weird about vitamin D, we classify it as a vitamin. But what's weird is the body takes vitamin D and it changes it. It goes through the liver and adds on what we call a hydroxyl group, heads to the kidney, gets another hydroxyl group. So then it becomes an active hormone. They call it 1,25 dihydroxycholecalciferol. So that's the name, right? 1,25 dihydroxycholecalciferol. Ultimately, what happens is this. It becomes an active hormone, and it works on specific cells throughout the body. All right? So one of the things it does is it regulates calcium balance. Okay, so in the bloodstream, we have a certain pH. I'm sure you've heard different people say alkalize or die and stuff like that. Well, the place you're going to have to stay alkalized is in the bloodstream. So the bloodstream has to be about 7.15 to roughly about 7.3 in its alkalinity. It's very, very much so just barely above the pH of pure water, right? So ultimately what happens is this, though, is calcium is what helps to maintain that acidity and alkaline balance in the blood. So where does the body get calcium? Obviously, you can consume calcium, but where's the storehouse? Well, it's in the bones. So what happens is vitamin D helps to regulate the balance of calcium in the blood. So when it converts into its 1,25 dihydroxycholecalciferol, it's also known as calcitonin. And so what it does is it does a couple of unique things. Number one, it helps to increase the absorption of calcium out of the intestines if the body needs more calcium. The other thing it does, it also works in the kidneys. It helps to prevent the kidneys from excreting too much calcium. If you're lacking calcium and the body's eliminating it, it says, no, you're not going anywhere. Get back here. We've got more work for you to do. Stay in the body. You're not going to get out of here. So there's two areas right away that it's working. The other area that it works as well too is this. It actually helps to regulate the parathyroid. So the parathyroid actually sends out a hormone and says, hey, we're lacking calcium in the blood. So go down, and the parathyroid hormone goes down to the bone, says start opening up, tear out some of this calcium and send it up to the blood tissue to alkalize. We're always staying in balance. By the way, this is going on all the time without you even knowing about it. It's called the autonomic nervous system. So it automatically or autonomically regulates pH balance in the bloodstream. All right. So kind of fun, crazy stuff, right? So ultimately what happens is vitamin D is one of the regulatory factors of this particular action that happens. Now, here's ultimate deficiency of vitamin D. You get rickets. It's also known as bow-legged. I've seen individuals with this. Once you get it, by the way, you can't get rid of it. So it's real critical for kids as they're growing up and their bones are forming to have vitamin D. It's absolutely essential. The other thing that can happen is what is later on in life known as osteomalacia, which basically means without enough vitamin D, then the bones just start tearing down and they don't metabolize back. So the on switch to tear down is there, but the off switch doesn't actually function well. Vitamin D helps to regulate that. So the other thing that happens is this, is you can actually get like other different complexities. And so here's the tweak. Those were the things that we knew about for years. Now all of a sudden there's this new little layer that's added onto vitamin D. So we start finding out this about vitamin D. As a hormone, it actually has receptors in different cells throughout the whole body. Well, the belief was like, hey, kidneys, intestines, as far as like the bones, things of that nature, all that makes sense. Well, check it out. Finally, by the late 80s, early 90s, we say, look, when it comes to T cells, we know that T cells, if they lack vitamin D, that they'll actually attack healthy cells. It's called autoimmune phenomenon. So actually now all of a sudden we're like going, well, wait a minute. I thought vitamin D was for bones, it was for calcium and stuff like that. No, check it out. We also know now that vitamin D helps to regulate the immune system. So during the last viral outbreak, vitamin D ends up being one of the critical nutrients. If you were lacking, it would increase your susceptibility to problems from the virus, including death rates. We actually know across the nation that the deficiency of vitamin D was one of the number one reasons why people might die from different types of viruses, such as like COVID and things of that nature. So that doesn't mean, by the way, that you go out and buy a bottle of vitamin D and hit huge amounts. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So here's the deal. We start seeing that vitamin D is necessary for regulation of the immune system, on-off switches in the immune system. The other thing we find out is this. At the cellular level, what happens when a virus hits it, we have in our immune system, and we might want to refer back to some of my podcasts on that about the immune system, we actually have what we call the inflammatory process. When something foreign comes into the system, the body goes, holy crap, Batman, here's something that's going to hurt us. So what we're going to do is we're going to literally create inflammation to kill it. And so what happens is if we overinflame, then we end up in a situation where we make things worse. They called it a cytokine storm. These cytokine storms can actually cause the virus to wreak havoc at a more accelerated pace. Guess what? Vitamin D helps with the regulation of those cytokine storms, inflammation. So not only is it not only working on the immune system, now we're starting to see it working on inflammation markers, autoimmune, different things of that nature. So vitamin D starts getting these crazy pictures. Well, why stop now? Let's go a little bit step further. We also see that in the thyroid. Vitamin D is necessary in the thyroid. Never thought vitamin D was going to be necessary for the thyroid. What do we know about the thyroid? It's always iodine, things of that nature. Vitamin D actually helps to modulate certain things in the thyroid. It's necessary for thyroid function. It's necessary for immune function. It's necessary for, it's just starting. As we turn around, it's going to be a little crazy. So here's a little history about vitamin D. We basically didn't know vitamin D even existed until 1940. So it's kind of fun if you look back at the flu pandemic in 1918. One of the problems that was going on in 1918 is it was kind of the birth of nutrition. One of the things that was happening is they were saying, one of the things we need to do is get people to eat enough food. Now today's nutritionalists are trying to say, hey, quit eating too much food, right? Because they weren't eating enough food and getting enough good foods. We look back now, mind you, this is looking back. This is retrospect, big time retrospect. We started saying, look, if we analyze a lot of these individuals in 1918, undoubtedly they were vitamin D deficient. What was known back then was this. If you drink cod liver oil, this stuff tastes like amazingly, insanely crazy, right? Some people like it. I particularly don't like it unless it's mixed with other different things. But people were using cod liver oil and saying, oh, it's the superfood of the nation. And what it does is ultimately helps to prevent you from getting the flu, helps with sickness, helps with bones. And everyone's like going, how could something like that do that? So we find out later on, hey, there's vitamin A in there. So everyone thought, hey, it was vitamin A that did that. Later on in 1940s, we go, oh, it's vitamin D. It's needed for bone metabolism. So here's the deal, though. Retrospectively speaking, individuals that were using cod liver oil during the 1918 flu pandemic had less severity. Okay, it's vitamin D is what it was all about. So then obviously it becomes a known nutrient. We need it. So a lot of times what happens with vitamin D is this. How much is enough? Well, one of the things that's interesting about vitamin D is your body can synthesize it. So the food choices for vitamin D are not good. Okay, bottom line is like mushrooms. Another thing is chickens that are fed food that have animal substances and animal fats that have vitamin D in it. So it's ultimately like liver and different things like that that has like sources of vitamin D, and it's animal things that have it. What happens if you're a vegan vegetarian? You got to eat a lot of mushrooms. Okay, ultimately what happens is this. The body usually makes up the difference by exposure to the sun. Cool, right? So go outside and you've heard it 1,000 times. Hey, I'm laying out. I'm like synthesizing vitamin D, right? We don't do that anymore, do we? We go lay out. What do? Grab the suntan screen because the last thing I want to do is get skin cancer, all right? Which is a legitimate concern. And then what does the sunscreen do? It blocks the sunlight's wavelengths, which converts the cholesterol in the skin into vitamin D. So guess what happens? Now we're going to go, hey, I'm going to synthesize vitamin D. No, you didn't, dude. So ultimately what they'll tell you is like 15, 20 minutes of exposure on your arms and things of that nature. And that's probably accurate for somebody who's young. Guess what happens when you're 50 and 60? Your ability to synthesize vitamin D goes down. Check this out too, winter months. So the sun rays become critical for helping to activate the mechanism underneath the skin that converts cholesterol into vitamin D. So here's the deal. Winter months, November until roughly almost like March, the synthesis of vitamin D slows down dramatically, especially the more northern you are in the hemisphere. So when it comes to like northern United States, so like Montana, the Dakotas, things like that, Canada, Alaska, all those different areas, man, you're probably not synthesizing much vitamin D at all right? So ultimately it becomes very interesting because we think, oh, the sunlight's going to take care of it. No, dude, it's still going to boil down to nutrition. You got to have it. So how much are we supposed to have a day? Ultimately, they just upped the RDA. For years, it was set at 400. At 400 is what, 10 IUs or 10 micrograms. Everything's kind of converting. We'll look at that. Here's a great one right here. Here's vitamin D3, 400 IUs. By the way, this is 10 micrograms. And then all of a sudden we see this. This is a 25 micrograms, which is 1,000. We'll talk a little bit about the dosing on that. So what happens is this. The body ends up in a situation where originally we thought 400 IUs was sufficient. And then all of a sudden, as we're going on, we end up with this. There is a national epidemic deficiency of vitamin D. You'll notice oftentimes when you go to the doctor, they check for vitamin D. It's critical. You've got to have enough in the bloodstream to help with viral complications and things of that nature. All right. So how much is enough? Typically, we have what is known as an upper tolerable limit. So that means food levels as well as supplement levels. Usually about 4,000 to 5,000 ends up being that upper tolerable limit. So the negative comes out with this. A lot of people, hey, look, liver doesn't quiver, bladder doesn't splatter, up the dosage doesn't really matter. Don't get me wrong. There's some incredible, your doctor oftentimes will recommend, hey, dude, you need to take 50,000 IUs a day. You're so deficient. I want you to take 50,000 or 20,000 or 10,000 a day for like a month or a week or whatever he's got down on the prescription. He wants to bring those levels up very quickly and then put you on the maintenance and check it in 3 months, make sure it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, right? All right, so then what you want, and we actually just got in, we're getting it in from a company called Omega Quadrant. You can actually do a prick test now. You prick it, you basically put it, almost like you're doing a glucose monitor. You check it and see, you send it off in the mail, and then it comes back. So I actually did it first time, deficient. Using supplements all the time. Using 2,000, I use the vitamin D, deficient. So I go on 4,000, add another 4,000, so I'm like at 6,000. Do it for a couple months. Prick test again 2 months later. Comes back. You're at the bottom of the good zone. So then I taper it back to roughly about 4,000, which is the upper tolerable limit, food and everything. And so then take it again in the good zone, staying in the good zone. So here's the negative though that happens. There's a U-shaped curve. You start going to where you're toxic. Remember, vitamin D is a fat-soluble compound. Too much for a long period of time can become toxic. Now all of a sudden the toxic dosages starts producing what you would have at the deficiency dosages. So you got to be careful, okay? Stay with the doc on this. Get the test done. If you're going to do some testing on your own, we've got them at the store. Omega Quantrin is the name of the company. Definitely something to do. All right. So I want to talk about vitamin K2. Vitamin K was discovered in 1936. So as they discovered, they said, check it out, man. There's like a family of these Ks. There's K1, there's K2, there's K7, there's K4, there's K6, there's K10. There's all these different things, and where in the and it had to do with the chains that were on the vitamin K. There's these different types of compounds, molecular compounds, and they just said, oh, the longer they are, count them. There's 6 of them, there's 4 of them, there's 7 of them, there's 10. So that's where the names come from, K2. And what they basically said is K1 is really the active compound. K2 really doesn't seem to have any benefit. Obviously, God made a mistake when he made it. Some of these K2s can convert if you're lucky, right? So ultimately, what does K do? We found that there's actually a nutrient deficiency situation. It's necessary for the clotting of blood. Okay, so cool. So everyone knows K1, that's what it's supposed to be for. 5 or 7 years ago, we finally started getting some decent research on some of the other compounds that are known as vitamin K. We actually find out that vitamin K2 is extremely unique. One of the things that you run into with supplementation of calcium sometimes is there's over-calcification in the body. So one of the concerns was there was a bunch of research done. A couple different groups said, hey, too much calcium deposits in the arteries, okay? So everyone starts digging in, looking at, well, you need vitamin D, because if the body doesn't have vitamin D, it doesn't know how to take the calcium and stuff it into the bones, right? So everyone starts looking at it and going, well, wait a minute. We're starting to see this K2 thing. We knew about K2 for a long time. What we know about K2 is this, is it actually activates a matrix complex called GLA protein. What this GLA protein does is it's actually the compound. So what happens, vitamin D stimulates the bone to try to absorb more calcium. But in order for that to convert into bone tissue, it needs vitamin K2. We always had vitamin K1 there because we knew vitamin K was the substance that did it. We actually find out that vitamin K2 is the actual substance that does this. And so ultimately, there's a couple different families in that K2, K4, K24, K27. And the K27 seems to be the most active out of all of them, although the K4 also seems to have some actions as well. So some companies like this, Jaro, started converting their bone up, which had K1 in it. They started changing it to K2. Yeah, it has calcium. Yeah, it has magnesium. It has everything to build the bones. But then at the same time, it also has vitamin D. By the way, they up their vitamin D because most people are critically low in it. And they also changed it to vitamin K2. So then they started doing some research, a little bit more research saying, well, here's the deal. Here's what we found out. This is a fun little research excerpt that I pulled up today before I came in. This was published in, I think, 2015, if I'm not correct. It says, previous study indicated positive effect of K2 supplementation on bone turnover biomarkers or bone mineral density. But does this varied and few studies have focused on the difference between vitamin K2 supplementation alone or combination with K2 or with calcium and D? So he goes on here and says they did some studies at the end. Bone loss was much less when it came to the use of vitamin K2 with vitamin D. At the same time, it also decreased calcification in the arteries. Very critical. So here's the deal. The K2 ultimately ends up being the substance that prevents it from depositing in the arteries and gets it to the bone where it belongs. Now let's talk about where you get K2. Guess what? You got to have good intestinal health. If you don't have good intestinal health and green leafy vegetables, you're not going to get K2 and you're not going to be able to actually ferment them and get them into the system. So actually your gut biologically ferments them, allows them to be freed up and changes them, gets them into from the K1s to K2s, makes all these little families so the body can absorb them. So if you're going to get adequate amounts of vitamin K, you got to be eating green leafy vegetables on a regular basis, have good probiotic bacteria content, and have good gut health, which means that you can't have like leaky gut and things of that nature. So that means you got to be eating pretty clean. As we know, guess what happens? Most people don't have that going on. So K2 supplementation literally bursts about 2015, maybe a little bit sooner, artery health. And I'm like going, are you kidding me? You're going to start telling me about artery health with K2? It causes blood clotting. Nope, that's not the case. K1 is the one that causes the clotting. K2 actually helps the calcium get to the right point. So you start seeing the birth of all these different substances. Vitamin D3 and vitamin K2 work together, and that's why you'll oftentimes see it. We've got chewable forms. We've got all sorts of different forms. Ultimately, what happens is this. Terry naturally puts out a product, and he calls it Artery Strong. Okay? So this Artery Strong product, he actually says on here, it's kind of fun, balance of vitamin A, vitamin D to support artery health. Strength. Vitamin K supports the mechanisms responsible for arterial wall strength. And so he actually kind of puts out a little bit of information on there. You can go on his site. He's got a little bit more information. So what we actually start seeing is this substance that we discovered in 1936 has a whole nother life to it. By the way, there's 7 of these things. If we actually start digging in, are we going to find out that you need a K1, a K2, a K3, a K4, it's possible, right? So let's go back to the cod liver moment, right? As I was saying before, we discovered vitamin A out of here first. Later on, we find that there's vitamin D. Now, of course, in the 90s, this literally took like 30 some odd years, 40 years to understand some of the oils that were in here. Remember I told you people would use this for arthritis and different things like that? Well, we thought it was the vitamin A. Then we thought it was the vitamin D. Ultimately, no. We actually find out there's omega-3s in there, anti-inflammatory, help not only with inflammation, also with the immune system. There's also another substance in there called alkyl glycerols, very popular in the 90s, helps with the immune system. So when it comes to whole foods, it can't be overstated. You've got to eat good foods. You got to have good superfoods coming into the diet to make a difference. Because ultimately, you might be lacking something that is in that food that really would be beneficial for your diet. So get rid of the junk food, eat the right foods. You might want to consider supplementing with vitamin D. I think that's critical. Also, for anybody that wants to have the K2 in there, I think it's a great benefit when it comes to artery strength and artery health. I think that would be something of a great value for anybody that's like thinking in that world. All right. So a little bit of information, lots of fun. Hopefully you enjoyed the segment. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you guys for joining us today on our Mission Nutrition podcast, the official Clark's Nutrition and Natural Foods Market podcast. We've got another exciting episode for you next week, so be sure to review, subscribe, follow us, and stay connected.
Absolutely. Be part of it. We've got so much we're going to share with you. It's going to be an amazing ride.
We'll see you next time.